Lieutenant Marcus Vire had never seen anything like it. His small rescue vessel hovered silently near the twisted remains of an alien ship caught in the gravity well of Epsilon 9, a dead planet with no name, no atmosphere, and no reason for anyone to be out here except for that mysterious distress signal. The beacon had pulsed faintly, almost like a whisper in the dark, a call that Earth's patrol grid had barely caught on the edge of its reach. Marcus, known for volunteering for missions others hesitated to take, had jumped at the chance. Now, floating before a broken hull that looked like it had been clawed apart by some ancient beast, he felt a chill crawl down his spine, the kind he hadn't felt even during his combat drop. The ship was unlike anything in Earth's database. Sleek curves that ended in jagged scars, a strange glowing lattice across the damaged panels, and no visible insignia or sign of life, just silence, heavy and haunting. But Marcus wasn't here to admire the wreckage. He suited up, locked his helmet, and guided his pod to dock at what remained of the rear airlock. A slow hiss followed, and then a dim green light flickered on, signaling a low-pressure seal. He stepped inside, boots clanking softly against the metal floor, flashlight beams slicing through floating dust and sparks. Every step deeper revealed more destruction, twisted bulkheads, scorched panels, melted doors, signs of a fight, maybe an ambush. No bodies, though. Not yet. The only sound was the faint hum of his suit's oxygen system and the distant creaking of the broken ship adjusting to gravity's weak pull. Then, just past a collapsed corridor, his scanner beeped faint life signs, barely holding on. He pushed forward, moving debris with careful precision until he found her. Curled in a corner, half covered in a burnt survival blanket, was the alien. A woman, he thought at first glance, though her features were strange and unfamiliar, pale blue skin like frozen mist, long hair that shimmered faintly like starlight, and eyes that flinched open the moment his light touched her. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, one arm twisted under her, the other raised weakly as if to shield herself. Marcus dropped to one knee, hands raised in peace, trying not to move too fast. "I'm here to help," he said calmly. His voice filtered through the translator mix. But instead of relief, the alien woman's face twisted in fear, and she braced herself not to be saved, but to die. Her expression wasn't confusion. It was acceptance, like she'd been found before, and it never ended well. Marcus saw it clearly in her eyes. She truly believed he was going to finish what whoever attacked her ship had started. The sight made his stomach tighten with something close to anger, not at her, but at whoever had made her expect death from a helping hand. Slowly, he pulled off one glove, letting her see the human skin beneath, unarmed, vulnerable. He didn't step closer. He simply placed a ration pack on the ground, slid a thermal wrap toward her, and set down a water capsule. She stared at the items as if they were foreign weapons. Then, after a long pause, she reached out, trembling, and touched the water pack. Her lips moved slowly as she drank, and he heard a soft sound in her throat, not words, but something like surprise. Marcus activated a gentle medical scan, ignoring the warning beeps about her critical state. She was badly injured, internal bleeding, oxygen deprivation, a fractured leg, and burns along her back. She wouldn't last long without help. "My name is Marcus," he said, tapping his chest. "Marcus." She didn't respond, but her eyes followed his movements. When he reached into his medkit, she flinched again, but didn't resist. Carefully, he applied a stabilizing foam over the worst of her wounds and then gave her a dose of universal antibiotics. He had no idea how her species would react, but doing nothing wasn't an option. Her breathing steadied a little, her body relaxing into the blanket. As he worked, Marcus noticed signs around her, strange markings on the walls, symbols like constellations and family crests burned into the bulkhead. Whatever species she belonged to, they had culture, identity, and pride. But something had hunted them. That much was clear. As he lifted her gently into the medlift and started toward his ship, the emergency lights flickered behind him. He didn't see the shadow watching from the cracked monitor in the next corridor, a thin trail of fluid moving like blood from the dark. Something else had been on the ship. Maybe still was. Back aboard his vessel, Marcus placed her in the recovery chamber, activated life support, and began uploading data from the wreck to Earth Command. He gave a brief summary: unknown alien species, one survivor, critical condition, ship destroyed by unknown force. But even as he typed, his mind raced. What kind of universe had this woman lived in where surrender meant death? And what had she survived, floating alone near a dead planet, waiting for the end? She stirred slightly, eyes opening again, and this time when she looked at Marcus, her fear was mixed with something else: confusion, maybe even a question. As if she couldn't understand why he'd helped her at all. He just smiled faintly and said again, "You're safe." She didn't reply, but didn't look away either. Marcus sat in the chair beside her pod and kept watch, unaware that far across the galaxy, someone had just received an alert: the last Serothi had been found. And she was with humans. The woman didn't speak for a full day. She lay quietly in the med pod, her body recovering slowly thanks to Marcus's emergency treatment, but her eyes remained alert, always watching him with the same careful fear, like someone who had known only betrayal from kind faces. Marcus didn't push her. He gave her space, kept his actions gentle, and spoke only when necessary. He told her about the ship, about Earth, about how humans were new to the galactic stage and had only recently joined the interstellar map after the invention of the slipstream engine. He didn't know if she understood, but it felt right to speak, as if silence would only remind her of whatever pain she had survived. On the second day, when Marcus brought her warm broth in a sealed pouch, she finally made a sound soft and strange, but deliberate. She pointed to herself and said, "Teleren." The translator couldn't fully process the sound, but it gave enough for Marcus to understand. That was her name. A real name. Not a file number, not a code. It meant she trusted him, at least a little. Marcus said her name softly in return, and for the first time, the tension in her shoulders eased. Over the next few hours, she started using the translator more, slowly, carefully. Her words were short, strained, and full of pain, not physical, but emotional. She told him her people were called the Serothi, once a proud and peaceful race of explorers and artists. They didn't build warships or empires. They believed in movement, in the beauty of drifting through stars and gathering stories from the edges of the known. But that made them vulnerable. During what she called the burning cycle, the Nyrel Empire rose to power: a cold and cruel species that believed only the strong deserved to survive. The Serothi didn't fight back at first. They tried to flee, to hide, to negotiate. But the Nyrel didn't want surrender. They wanted erasure. One by one, Serothi ships vanished. Colonies burned. Her voice cracked when she described the last sanctuary moon, how she had watched it fall from orbit under Nyrel bombardment. Teleren had been on a mission to find others who might help, allies in hidden corners of the stars. Her ship wasn't a war vessel. It was a scout with light defenses. They never had a chance when the attackers came. Her voice grew quieter then, and she admitted something Marcus wasn't prepared for. She had sent the distress call not because she believed anyone would help, but because she wanted someone to remember. Even if she died, she wanted proof that the Serothi had existed. Marcus sat in silence, unable to speak for a long moment. In her story, he saw echoes of humanity's own past times, when Earth had turned its face away from the suffering of others, from wars and genocides too far from home to feel real. But this time was different. Marcus hadn't come across her by accident. He had responded because it was the right thing to do, even if no one had expected him to. "You're not going to be forgotten," he said firmly, and for the first time, she looked at him not as a threat, but as something strange and unfamiliar: hope. They weren't alone long. A priority transmission came in from Earth Command, encrypted and urgent. Marcus explained everything: the alien woman, the wreckage, her story. But the response he received wasn't what he expected. The Council acknowledged the report, expressed diplomatic caution, and ordered Marcus to return to Earth for debriefing, with heavy emphasis on discretion. No media. No public attention. And definitely no promise of asylum. The message was clear: Earth wasn't ready to get involved in someone else's war. Marcus stared at the orders for a long time before shutting the screen. He glanced back at Teleren, who had fallen asleep curled under the thermal blanket like a child. He couldn't tell her. Earth might turn her away. Not yet. As his ship glided through the quiet of deep space, Marcus made a choice. He would bring her home. He would tell her story, even if command wanted silence. Because what good was humanity's place in the stars if it meant turning its back on those who needed help? But as the vessel crossed into known space, an alert flashed on the radar. Unidentified crafts. Fast. Closing in. Marcus knew instantly they weren't Earth ships, and they weren't friendly. He pulled the ship into evasive mode, activating decoys and redirecting power to shields. Telerin awoke at the sudden jolt, panic flashing in her eyes. "They found us," she whispered, and Marcus saw her hands tighten around the blanket. No one had said the word Nirel, but they both knew. The enemy wasn't finished. The ship rocked with impact. Marcus steered hard toward the nearest asteroid belt, hoping to lose them in the field of drifting debris. It wasn't just a race for survival, now it was a race to tell the truth. And if they failed, Teely wouldn't be the last Sarathi. She would be the forgotten. The ship rattled again as another blast hit the rear stabilizer, lights flickering in the cockpit, while warning alarms screamed in Marcus's ears, but he didn't stop. With his jaw clenched and hands gripping the controls, he pushed the ship deeper into the asteroid belt, weaving through sharp rock clusters and frozen debris with desperate speed. The enemy craft, smaller and faster than his vessel, stayed close, their blue energy trails snaking between the stones like silent hunters. Telerin clung to the side rail in the medbay, eyes wide but silent now, her fear buried under something colder, memory. She had run before. She had watched friends vanish into fire. But this time, she wasn't alone. This time, the human didn't abandon her. Marcus pulled a hard turn, flipping the ship sideways between two massive chunks of rotating rock, then cut engine power completely. The ship went dark. He held his breath as the fighter shot past, searching, scanning, unaware that he had gone cold. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, one by one, the blips disappeared from the radar. Marcus waited 2 more minutes, just in case, then sighed and powered the ship back online. Systems flickered, wounded but alive. They weren't safe yet, but they were still breathing. He turned back toward the medbay where Telerin was sitting now, breathing hard, clutching her chest as if forcing her heart to stay in place. "You've done this before," Marcus said, sliding down beside her. She nodded faintly. "Too many times." He didn't ask what she had lost. He could already see it in her eyes. When they reached Earth orbit, the station controllers demanded an explanation for the ship's damage and unlogged detour. Marcus didn't lie, but he didn't tell the full truth either. He reported a hostile encounter, uploaded fragments of sensor data, and requested immediate medical attention for the passenger. There were delays, protocols, endless questions. Earth Command finally granted clearance, but with strict security. Telerin was to be examined, then transported to a classified holding facility until diplomatic steps could be decided. Marcus didn't like the sound of it, but he had no choice. At least, not yet. The moment they docked, med teams arrived wearing bioshields and armed escorts, treating Telerin more like a captured experiment than a guest. She looked around the bright station halls with narrowed eyes, uncertain if she had reached safety or another prison. Marcus stayed by her side as long as they let him, speaking softly, reminding her that she wasn't alone. Before they separated him from her, she grabbed his hand suddenly and whispered, "Don't let them silence me." It wasn't a plea. It was a warning. Marcus filed a formal request to speak before the Earth Council, bypassing his chain of command. It was a risky move, possibly career-ending, but he didn't care. This wasn't just about one alien anymore. It was about what humanity would choose to become in the galaxy, another silent bystander or something better. The council chamber was packed, its white walls polished like marble, flags of Earth nations lining the edges. High-ranking officials sat behind curved desks, eyes tired, curious, skeptical. Marcus stood alone at the center, with nothing but a small holo recording of Telerin's story and the wreckage footage from her destroyed ship. He didn't give a military report. He told a human story of a woman who braced for death when help arrived because her kind had never been rescued before. Of a species hunted for kindness. of a galaxy that had learned to look away. His voice didn't shake. He didn't shout. He just spoke with truth. When the projection of Teleren's face battered, but proud, flickered into the air beside him. "She thought I came to finish her," Marcus said quietly. "What kind of galaxy teaches people to expect death from a helping hand?" The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Outside the chamber, word spread fast. News outlets picked up the story despite government filters. Regular citizens watched the footage, heard the translated voice of a Sarathi survivor, and felt something stir. They didn't know what the Nyrel Empire was. They didn't understand the politics. But they saw a wounded woman who had survived the impossible, and they saw a human who had chosen to protect her when no one else did. The message reached deeper than expected. Children sent messages of support. Activists began pushing for transparency. And when Telerin appeared briefly, escorted and still recovering, and spoke 3 simple words on camera, "We are still here," it shook the public heart. Not everyone supported Marcus. Within Earth Command, some called him reckless. A few accused him of risking war with powers they barely understood. But other scientists, diplomats, defense strategists saw a different opportunity, an alliance built not on power, but principle. Marcus was placed on temporary leave, pending full investigation. But that didn't stop him. Using his contacts, he began quietly reaching out to other alien voices, those scattered on the edges of space who had suffered under the Nyrel's rule. What started as whispers became something more. With Teleren's help, they decoded Sarathi communications that had gone unanswered for years. A broken network began to rebuild, one survivor at a time. She became more than a symbol. She became a leader. And Marcus, for the first time, understood why the Nyrel had tried so hard to erase her people. Because if even one Sarathi lived one voice, one story, one spark, it could set fire to an empire. But as Earth's debates grew louder and the fragile alliance began to take form, a shadow moved in the dark. In deep space, far beyond Earth's reach, the Nyrel High Council had noticed. One of their captains returned, badly damaged, reporting interference by humans and the escape of a Sarathi survivor. The news reached the Chancellor's ears. He smiled, cold and thin. "So," he said, "the children from Earth have found their courage. Let's see how long it lasts." And somewhere between the stars, a fleet began to move, not for conquest, but for a warning. The stars above Earth grew restless. Deep in the silence between systems, sensors began to whisper of movement, unnatural, synchronized, and vast. The Nyrel fleet was coming, not with diplomacy, not with threats, but with a message forged in fire. Back on Earth, the Council debated behind closed doors, while Marcus moved through shadowed halls, meeting with voices that had once been ignored, alien refugees, wanderers, exiles, the last survivors of forgotten worlds. They came quietly at first, unsure whether humans were truly different from the powers that had failed them before. But when they met Telerin, heard her speak not with rage, but with resolve, something shifted. The room where she stood was small, a quiet government briefing chamber turned meeting point, but her words reached across hearts. She spoke not of revenge, but of remembering. She didn't demand weapons. She asked for unity. "The Nyrel want silence," she told them. "So we will become the voice they cannot erase." And one by one, those who had stayed silent for too long nodded. The beginnings of an alliance were born not through treaties, but through shared grief and a will to survive. Marcus, though officially on leave, was now acting as a quiet bridge, the human link trusted by both sides. He saw how Telerin changed, no longer just a survivor, but someone who stood taller each day, learning Earth's languages, its politics, its stubborn divisions. And in return, she gave them stories they had never heard, stories of ancient worlds, of Sarathi cities floating on clouds, of songs sung in orbit to calm younglings afraid of space. It was a culture too beautiful to be lost, and humanity began to understand what was truly at stake. Scientists raced to study what remained of the Sarathi tech Marcus had recovered. Engineers wept quietly at the elegant code and power systems. Telerin showed them technology light years ahead, built not for war, but for harmony. And still, the fleet moved closer. Earth Command eventually could no longer ignore the signals. When the Nyril flagship was spotted just beyond Saturn's orbit, they weren't just coming. They had arrived. But they didn't attack, not yet. Instead, a single message was broadcast across open channels, spoken in a voice cold and perfect: return what is ours, or be counted among the forgotten. It was not a request. It was a statement, and it shook the world. The council froze. Some pushed to hand Telerin over immediately. Others argued for diplomacy. But Telerin stood before them, face calm, and said, "They do not want me. They want silence. If you give me to them, they will still erase you." Marcus didn't wait for votes. He gathered those who believed: engineers, medics, soldiers, and diplomats, and began preparations for something no one on Earth had planned for. The first meeting of the newly formed Starborn Coalition took place in orbit, aboard an old Earth freighter, refitted with Sarathi shielding. Representatives from 7 species attended, each carrying scars of war and exile. There was no anthem, no flags, just one long table, and the understanding that unity might be the only weapon left. Telerin spoke first, as always. "We do not ask Earth to fight alone," she said. "We ask Earth to lead by not turning away." The words were simple, but in that silence between stars, they meant everything. Marcus spoke next, outlining what little intel they had on the Nyril fleet's formation. It was brutal, efficient, precise, not built for war, but for ending resistance before it could begin. Yet every time they erased a world, a few always escaped. And now, those few were no longer alone. Defense plans were rushed. Earth's orbital stations were reinforced with what the Sarathi called skybone plating, materials resistant to heat and kinetic force. Old satellites were converted into decoys. Communication arrays were linked across 3 systems. But it wasn't enough. Everyone knew that. The Nyril were coming, and Earth had never fought a war in the stars. What they had, what no empire could match, was the will to fight for someone else. The people of Earth saw the images of Teleren's destroyed ship, of the ruins left in the wake of the Nyril, and they didn't look away. Volunteers surged. Pilots trained day and night. Even the civilians gathered food, printed parts, sent messages of support into space. For the first time in centuries, Earth wasn't just defending itself, it was standing up for others. And then came the first strike. A Nyril scout ship entered Earth's orbit undetected and fired on one of the outer moon stations, not a military post, but a scientific lab hosting a Sarathi archive team. 10 were killed. Among them was a boy named Lauren, only 13 Earth years old, gifted in language, who had been working with Telerin to translate ancient Sarathi music into human sound. When Marcus gave her the news, she didn't cry. She walked to the station's observation deck, looked out at the stars, and sang not a battle cry, but a mourning song, soft and filled with a pain too old for words. And somehow, the coalition heard it. Across 3 systems, ships paused. Heads bowed. Silence fell. And in that silence, resolve was born not out of hate, but out of heartbreak. Back on Earth, the Council finally voted. It was not unanimous. It was not easy. But it was enough. Earth would stand with the Starborn. An official message was sent to the Nyril: "We do not return survivors to executioners." The response was instant, a fleet veering toward Earth at impossible speed. Tile turned to Marcus as the final alerts blared, and for the first time since he found her dying on a shattered ship, she smiled. "Now," she said softly, "they will know we are not forgotten." The warning lights never stopped blinking. Earth's orbit lit up like a beacon as ships prepared for what could be the first and last true space battle humanity would ever face. The Nyril fleet was massive, black and smooth like blades pulled from a starless sea, cutting through the vacuum with perfect silence. But they weren't alone in the void. All around Earth, the Starborn Coalition had gathered, patched-up refugee cruisers, outdated scout ships reinforced with Sarathi tech, and Earth's still developing fighters, clumsy but fast, full of fire and hope. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and they knew it. But they held the line near Epsilon Gate, the last deep space relay between Earth and the rest of the galaxy. If that gate fell, help would never come. Teleren stood at the command console of the central flagship, not in a sealed room, but beside Marcus and the rest of the human officers. Her robes had been changed into an Earth-issued pilot suit, and though her face held the grace of the old Sarathi ways, her eyes now burned with purpose. The first wave hit without warning. Beams of silent energy cracked across the darkness, colliding with Coalition shields and cutting through weaker ships like paper. One station collapsed within minutes, its hull folding in on itself. But then came the response. Human fighters darted between Nirel formations, drawing fire, leading them into mined asteroid zones prepared by Sarathi engineers. An old Freyan cruiser, its engines barely holding together, launched a blinding solar flare pulse, disorienting several enemy ships long enough for Earth's bombers to move in. Explosions flared like silent fireworks, bright against the dark. For every ship, the Coalition lost, 2 Nirel burned. Not because they were stronger, but because they refused to vanish. Marcus led the coordination from the main deck, shouting updates as crews adapted on the fly. He had never been a commander before, but he didn't need rank-only trust. And Teleren was his shadow, guiding with knowledge older than any Earth warbook. She knew how Nirel formations thought, where they would press, how they handled the chaos of desperation. For a while, it looked like the line might hold. The Coalition even scored a direct hit on a Nirel carrier, sending its shattered body tumbling into Saturn's orbit. But then came the Second Fleet. Hidden. Waiting. Massive. They emerged from the other side of the system like a tidal wave, darkening space itself. And at the center of their formation, the Nirel command ship unlike anything seen before. It didn't fire. It just advanced. Slow. Unstoppable. The message was clear. Earth was next. Fall back, some cried. Abandon the gate. But Marcus stood firm. If we give them the gate, he said, we give them the future. Silence followed. And then, without waiting for orders, one ship stayed behind the smallest of the Coalition fleet. A Sarathi memory vessel, not built for war, but for storing voices of the past. Its captain spoke over the comms. We carry the names of the lost. We will not let them fall silent again. The ship charged forward. A single vessel against a fleet. It didn't survive, but it bought time. Time for Marcus and Teleren to execute the final plan. It was a risk they had discussed in whispers. Epsilon Gate's old core was never meant to hold so much energy. But if overloaded just right, if calibrated by both Earth tech and Sarathi design, it could release a pulse strong enough to tear a hole in space itself. Not a weapon. A signal. A cry so loud the entire galaxy would hear. Let them come, Teleren said, her hand on the control crystal. Let them hear us. Marcus stood beside her, every warning system screaming in red. And together, they activated the core. The gate lit up like a star being born. Nirel ships reeled back. Energy surged, waves of it, not just through weapons systems, but through communications, long-range frequencies, ancient channels forgotten by time. The scream of the lost, the voice of the survivors, the truth of what had been done, it all flowed out in one blinding surge. Across the galaxy, from hidden moons to distant colonies, people heard it. Saw it, felt it, and they rose. The pulse didn't destroy the Nirel, but it did what nothing else had ever done. It made them retreat. Not out of fear, but because, for the first time, the galaxy was watching. They couldn't hide their crimes behind shadows anymore. Their silence had been broken. Epsilon Gate was badly damaged, but still standing. Half the Coalition fleet had fallen. But Earth still lived. And so did Teleren. She stood on the observation deck as the stars slowly returned to calm, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass. Marcus joined her, exhausted, covered in burns, but alive. We did it, he said softly. She shook her head, eyes still fixed on the sky. No. We just lit the first flame. Behind them, messages flooded in not just from Coalition worlds, but from new voices. ones who had never spoken before. Voices ready to stand, to remember, to fight. And somewhere in the galaxy, the Nero began to understand. Silence was no longer their shield. The war wasn't over. But it had changed. Because when Marcus had reached out to help, the woman who expected death found something else instead of future.